Ancient societies understood the concept of justice and recognized legitimacy, but both concepts were sort of heavily biased in favor of those who wielded the heavier bone. Justice and legitimacy were the strong man's domain over the weak. Women, neighbours, servants, and so on. People understood concepts, like self-determination, but it never occurred to them that many such concepts can be rights for individual humans, let alone universal rights to be enjoyed by all humans. But the greatest puzzle of all is why it took mankind thousands of years and two great wars before they finally discovered the concept of universal human rights. Perhaps we were too preoccupied with power and property rights. No discussion of human rights can be whole without a talk about democracy, since both have become intertwined. Before ancient Greece introduced the concept of democracy, similar practices existed in earlier civilizations, like 7th century BC India and Mesopotamia. The Greeks acknowledged the right of all citizens to vote. Trouble was, women and slaves did not count as citizens. Such perceived inequalities between humans would spell disaster for thousands of years, not just for women, but also for black people in particular. The idea of rights and democracy started to shape up in England way back in the Middle Ages. In 1215, English Parliament issued the charter known as the Magna Carta to protect individual freedom against unlawful imprisonment. Nevertheless, only 3% of the population had the right to vote, so inequality between citizens was still rife. 400 years after the Magna Carta, the English philosopher John Locke proposed the concept of natural rights. He wrote that in a natural state all people were equal and independent, and everyone had a natural right to defend his life, health, liberty, or possessions. These words inspired the Parliament's Bill of Rights, which was passed in 1689, and seem to have also inspired the concept of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that appeared in the American Declaration of Independence of 1776. In the United States, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness excluded a certain type of human. The 1788 Constitution asserted that slaves were property and legalized their killing in the event of attempted escape. But some Americans called for the abolition of slavery, notably the journalist and reformer William Lloyd Garrison, who described the Constitution as a covenant with death, an agreement with hell. In 1755, the newly independent Republic of Corsica set about writing its own constitution, and soon became the first sovereign nation to implement suffrage to all of its inhabitants, including females. Unfortunately, the French invaded the island and revoked the constitution in 1769. A sovereign nation to implement suffrage to all its inhabitants, including females.
But all was revoked when the French invaded the island in 1769 and the Republic was no more. 3 decades later, however, the French colonies abolished slavery and made white and black equals. The National Convention of 1794 determined that all men without distinction of color residing in the colonies are French citizens and will enjoy all the rights assured by the Constitution. But once again, democracy and civil rights were dealt a blow when Napoleon dismissed the National Convention and reinstated slavery in 1802.
Soon after Napoleon reinstated slavery, and almost 200 years after Locke proclaimed that everyone had natural rights, the emphasis in England started shifting to the rights of women. In 1880s England, the philosopher John Stuart Mill tackled the thorny question of women's issues and began to write in favour of greater rights for women, including the right to vote. In 1851, John Mill's wife Harriet published the essay The Enfranchisement of Women, which was echoed in 1869 by her husband's essay on the subjection of women. Curiously, but not surprisingly perhaps, John Mill's essay was countered by Ernest Beaufort Bax's essay, The Legal Subjugation of Men. While all this politeness was taking place in England, something magical was transpiring in a place far, far away. No, not in North America.
By 1893, New Zealand was the only country in the world to have granted equal voting rights to all of its citizens, irrespective of origin, race, or gender. These rights included the indigenous Maori. In 1894, Australia adopted a similar approach and became the first country ever to grant women the right to run for parliament.
But, back in England, women in the early 1900s formed a movement that became known as the suffragettes, and had to endure imprisonment, torture in the form of force feeding, and even the occasional death to make their voices heard as they demanded the right to vote. Surprisingly, it was a Liberal government in 1913 which was behind the infamous Cat and Mouse Act. The Act suspended force feeding and allowed those who were severely weakened by hunger strike to leave prison. The idea was that if women died after release, it would be of her own doing. Even though the Act stopped the practice of force feeding, under the Act any wrongdoing by the ex-prisoner would automatically land her back in prison. Back to the United States. Suffrage started extending to women beginning with Wyoming in 1869. In 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution extended the suffrage to women across the United States in time for the 1920 presidential election. Canada enfranchised women in 1919, but the UK gave the vote in 1918 to women who met certain property qualifications. Fortunately, this limitation was removed in 1928 when all women over 21 enjoyed the right to vote. Switzerland was the last Western democracy to succumb to common sense. Although women were first allowed to vote in 1957 in a tiny commune of Canton Valais, the Lady Mayor of Geneva was unable to vote in the 1968 federal elections. In fact, when Switzerland signed the European Convention on Human Rights, the government sought to opt out of the bits relating to sexual equality. Finally, in 1971, two-thirds of Swiss men came to their senses and allowed their women the right to full federal voting. In fact, one canton makes it compulsory to vote. In the beginning, we said that democracy and human rights have become inseparable. South Africa is a prime example of this relationship. South African white women started enjoying the right to vote and serve in Parliament in 1930. Although blacks were able to vote, in 1937 they were separated from other voting races. 20 years later, in 1957, coloured voters were separated from white voters. And finally, in 1960, black voters lost their right to vote altogether. In 1984, a new constitution re-enfranchised coloured men and women and enfranchised the Indian population. The blacks remained disenfranchised. But South African history was on a course to collision with greatness. On 11th of February 1990, and after 27 years of imprisonment, a black activist was released from prison, and he would set about writing the historic and momentous events that would change South Africa forever. By 1994, every South African man and woman were equally franchised, and on 27th of April 1994, the first ever non-racial elections took place. For the first time in its history, South Africa now had a president who was elected in a fully representative democratic election. He was the great Nelson Mandela. Mandela served as president from 1994 until 1999. While it took thousands of years to grant voting rights to their citizens, some countries have taken this right to the opposite extreme. If you don't use it, you lose it. Step. Freudian slip there. If you don't use it, you lose your freedom. Amongst the countries that enforce compulsory voting are Australia, Argentina, Brazil, Luxembourg, and the Swiss canton of Schaffhausen. Well, that crept up. No, it's all right, don't worry.
Schaffhausen.
Yeah, Schaffhausen. I had to switch to German to do that. Amongst the countries that enforce compulsory Amongst the countries that enforce compulsory voting are Australia, Argentina, Brazil, Luxembourg, and the Swiss canton of Schaffhausen. Some countries who have compulsory voting do not enforce it. These include Egypt, Belgium, and Greece.